Thank you. It's so great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brianna Fitzpatrick. I'm the UN representative for Caritas Internationalis, the International Confederation of Catholic Charities. And our office is just upstairs. We keep Italian coffee if you're ever in the neighborhood and want to stop by for a chat. That was way more efficient than 5 minutes, so we're off to a great start. Thank you for finding your seats, and thank you to those of us joining online. So a few housekeeping items, since there are people online, and to not disrupt any of the speakers, if you can turn your phones on silent, that would be greatly appreciated. Feel free to keep them out, take pictures, post to social media, tag us, things like that. Just keep them on silent. And then for questions and answers, so that everyone online can see you, we will ask you to come up to this microphone stand. But if that feels uncomfortable to you, you can write a question down on some paper that the ushers have, and I'll read the question for you. But you might get tired of my voice all day, but happy to do that for you. So I know we usually end with thank yous, but I didn't want to forget. So I'm going to start the morning with thank yous, if that's all right with everyone. I do want to thank Fordham University's International Political, Economic, and Development Program, all of the students who were here bright and early. Technical program have written the report, and of course, Professor S. and Donna, who's usually in the, yes, I see her in the back. So thank you very much. And to Catholic Relief Services and all those who worked on the event, including but not limited to Claire, Jess, and Tom. Jess and Tom, who are in the room and who many of you know personally. And then Villanova. Can the Villanova grad students or university students raise their hand? So they have a table just in the center of the back here. So on the breaks, be sure to talk to them about their grad programs and things like that. And they'll also be available at lunch. So thank you for being here. And of course, for all of you for being present here on a Friday morning. I know there's plenty of work to be done around the United Nations. There's plenty of exams to study for and projects to be done, but you made time to be here, and we're so grateful for that. We're really proud to partner with Fordham and CRS every year for this annual release of the Pope Francis Poverty Index. It's such an important tool for all of us working in the humanitarian and development sphere. We're also grateful to hear from experts at CRS at this event each year for a deeper dive into the issues that those living in poverty face each and every day. Every year, we're also humbled to have with us a staff member of the Holy See Mission to the United Nations, who will now offer welcoming remarks. But before I give over the podium, I'd like to formally introduce Ms. Kira Hogan, attaché and expert negotiator to the United Nations. Does that fit on a business card? In her role, Kira negotiates UN resolutions on behalf of the Holy See, working with representatives from delegations from other UN member and observer states. She serves with the mission's Human Rights and Development team, and her portfolio covers all matters related to sustainable development, climate change and the environment, and humanitarian affairs. Small portfolio. She previously spent 9 months as a fellow with the mission, and before her work with the mission, Kira spent 3 years working for the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, or CAFOD, which is also a member of Caritas, in their fundraising and participation department. She has a bachelor's degree in politics and philosophy from the London School of Economics and a master's degree in international development and climate change from the Global Development Institute, based in her home city of Manchester. Kira, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of His Excellency, Archbishop Gabriele Caccia, Permanent Observer of the Holy See to the United Nations, I would like to express heartfelt gratitude to Fordham University and the IPED programme for organising this important event. Today, as we gather to mark the World Day of the Poor, we renew our shared commitment to those suffering from the injustice of poverty. Fordham's Pope Francis Global Poverty Index is an important measure of the progress we have made while highlighting the work that remains. The Holy See would like to thank IPED, Caritas and CRS for their continued dedication to highlighting the needs of the poorest through this work. The World Day of the Poor calls us to honour our shared humanity and to fulfil our moral responsibility to the poor. Pope Francis, in his message for this year's observance, reminds us that no one is excluded from God's heart, for in his eyes, we are all poor and needy. This day is a powerful reminder to embrace our dependence on one another, to dismantle indifference, to listen to the voice of those in need, and to build a world where every person's dignity is recognised and protected. Poverty is an affront to the inherent human dignity of every person. In its many forms, poverty causes tremendous harms to individuals, families, and entire communities. It is why, in 2015, the international community came together to affirm that poverty is the greatest global challenge. Almost a decade on, the United Nations recently declared that poverty remains the greatest global challenge in the Pact for the Future, noting that it is also an imperative for humankind. Although some progress has been made in its eradication, too many still face the injustice of poverty. The COVID-19 pandemic, conflicts, and economic turbulence have set back global efforts to eradicate poverty. In fact, in 2020, we saw the first global increase in the number of those living in extreme poverty for decades. It is abundantly clear that more needs to be done to ensure that we realise the shared goal of no poverty by 2030. As we reflect on poverty, we must consider one urgent aspect that affects millions of lives: access to water. The global water crisis exacerbates poverty, driving cycles of illness, hunger, and deprivation. Pope Francis affirms in Laudato Si that access to safe drinkable water is a basic and universal human right, one that is essential to life and to the exercise of all other human rights. And yet, for many around the world, the lack of clean water and sanitation means a daily struggle against preventable diseases and an increased vulnerability to poverty. Today, nearly 1 in 3 people lack access to safely managed drinking water, and more than half of the global population is without adequate sanitation. These statistics are more than just numbers. They represent the lives of people we are leaving behind and futures left uncertain. Those suffering most from this crisis are often the world's poorest, the very people whom this day seeks to honour and uplift. Water scarcity and unsafe water supplies affect those in the most vulnerable of situations, disproportionately impacting women, children, rural communities, and people living in areas of conflict. It is a scandal that hundreds of thousands of children die each year from preventable diseases caused by lack of sanitation and inadequate hygiene. This is an ongoing tragedy and a moral failure that calls each of us to action. The connection between poverty and water access is clear. Without clean water, individuals and communities cannot thrive. Children miss out on school due to waterborne illnesses, and women spend hours each day searching for water, losing opportunities for employment, education, and community engagement. The lack of access to this essential resource traps millions in cycles of poverty. On the World Day of the Poor, we are reminded that our commitment to the poor cannot be separated from our commitment to ensuring access to life's most basic necessities. Addressing the water crisis requires us to embrace what Pope Francis calls an integral ecology. This holistic approach unites the care for our common home with care for each other. It compels us to see water not merely as a resource, but as a treasure that sustains life and should be preserved for the common good. An integral ecology approach also calls for joint action. Governments, private entities, and civil society, including faith-based organisations, must work together to address systemic problems and put in place the practical solutions to ensure that all have their most basic needs met and their right to water realised. Equally essential is a shift in how we view water itself. The Holy See calls on the international community to recognise water not as a commodity, but as a shared resource that we must protect and distribute fairly. As Pope Francis warns, even as the quality of available water is constantly diminishing, in some places there is a growing tendency to privatise this resource, turning it into a commodity subject to the laws of the market. Such commodification threatens to deny access to the poor and those on the margins, thus perpetuating cycles of poverty and inequality. We must therefore resist efforts to exploit water for profit at the expense of those who need it most. Today, as we come together to mark the World Day of the Poor, let us remember that our response to the water crisis is a reflection of our commitment to the dignity of every person. Just as water nourishes and sustains, so must our actions, rooted in compassion and justice, uplift those most affected by scarcity and suffering. The poor, who often experience the first and harshest effects of water shortages, call on us to act not out of charity alone, but out of a conviction that a world in which water and other essential resources are fairly shared is a world that honours God's vision for humanity. In closing, may we answer Pope Francis's call on the 8th World Day of the Poor to be friends of the poor, following in the footsteps of Jesus, who always began by showing solidarity with the least among us. Let us commit to building a world where no one thirsts, in body or spirit, and where the dignity of each person is upheld. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction to the day, Kira. I know you have to go to another meeting, but we're so grateful that you could be with us this morning. I really appreciate the note on embracing our dependence on one another. It reminds me of the communities in which we live and the way that Jesus worked with his disciples and taught his disciples to also live in community. And it is the only way that we will face the challenges of poverty together and uplift the dignity of the human person. We will learn more about these challenges in this year's debut of the 2024 Pope Francis Poverty Index. And I will hand it over to our three presenters, but first I'd also like to introduce them. So of course, many of you know Professor S. Henry, the director of Fordham University's IPED program, also a professor of economics at Fordham. Henry earned his PhD in economics from Columbia University, and his research publications are primarily in the area of international trade and economic development. He has traveled extensively in East Asia, Oceania, West Africa, and Southern Africa. Today, he'll be joined by two Fordham IPED class of 2025 graduate students. The first is Miss Anna Barragan. Did I say it right? Yes. Okay. Anna is a Fulbright Fellow at Fordham and received her undergraduate degree in Administrative Computer Systems from the Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico, where she specialized in multimedia studies. She has lived in Australia, Brazil, Mexico, Panama, and the United States. We'll also be joined by Miss Genevieve Connell, who is the Public Service Fellow at Fordham. Genevieve received her undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where she majored in international studies, Chinese and French. She has traveled to South Africa, the Philippines, China, Mongolia, and France. So, world travelers, please come up to the podium, and we're looking forward to your presentation on the trends in global poverty.
Thank you, Brianna, for the, right in front of me, that's why I can't see you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I want to also thank Caritas Internationalis and Catholic Relief Services for co-sponsoring this UN side event to commemorate Pope Francis's World Day of the Poor. We also, I want to thank Ms. Hogan for representing the Holy See. Since she had to go to a meeting, we want to give you our copy, our official copy of the report to Brianna. Donna's going to give it to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, they're going to take a picture of you all.
Sorry.
Thank
you very much. Thank you.
And of course, thank you all for coming. Let me introduce, well, you know, this is Anna, who was introduced. She's from Mexico, a Fulbright scholar, and was one of the research associates or assistants in producing this report. She's very nervous, so be kind to her, right? You're going to speak slowly, right?
Yes.
Okay. And this is Genevieve from Wisconsin. And you heard, well, she's also one of our research assistants. And this past summer, she was working on the UN Human Development report for Mongolia. She was in Mongolia this past summer. So that's our team here. Okay, let me now begin the presentation. The main result of this year's report is that the recovery from the pandemic that we observed last year in reducing the global poverty gap may have stalled. With respect to basic material needs in 2024, we found some improvement in the poor's access to drinking water and above subsistence level employment. Unfortunately, we also observed no significant progress in the poor's access to adequate housing and gender equity. And on the alarming side, we found a continued deterioration in the poor's access to food and religious freedom. So just to summarize, 2 indicators were positive, 3 were neutral, and 2 were negative. And overall, basically no improvement from the previous year.
Our measure of extreme global poverty is based on the concept of integral human development. as drawn from the writings of Pope Paul VI and his friend the philosopher Jacques Maritain, one of the architects of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Integral human development argues that to live a full, integrated, and dignified human life, humans need a range of both material goods and spiritual freedoms. Based on this concept, Pope Francis, when he visited the United Nations in 2015, suggested that in order to understand extreme global poverty and employment, the remaining three of these indicators are critical spiritual freedoms, non-tangible goods that we need in order to guide our own lives: education, civil liberties, and religious freedom.
Following the Pope's suggestions, we have developed Fordham's Pope Francis Global Poverty Index, which has proven to be a unique measure of human well-being because of its focus on both extreme material poverty and lack of critical spiritual freedoms. This morning, we will review the 7 different components of the Fordham Francis Index and then conclude with the determination of our global poverty gap for 2024. Anna will now begin our review of the different components of the index by looking at what might be the most fundamental physical human need that we have: access to drinking water. This basic human need will be further explored later this morning by our keynote speaker from Catholic Relief Services, Ms. Lori Pearson. Also at your leisure, please visit the display organized by our friends from Villanova on this topic, which is behind this large pillar.
Monitoring program of the World Health Organization and UNICEF, we obtain data on the percentage of a nation's population that lack access to drinking water from an improved source, such as a well, within a 13-minute period. Looking at the graph projected on the room's screens, we can see that the number of people lacking access to drinking water has consistently declined from 2013 to 2022. Still, based on the most recently available data, about 9% of the world's population, roughly 700 million people, lack basic access to water. Genevieve will now look at the other fundamental physical need we track at the Fordham Francis Index: access to food.
The UN Food and Agricultural Organization produces data on the percentage of a country's population who are continuously unable to consume enough food to meet their dietary energy requirements. As you can see on the graph, since 2017, the number of people suffering from undernourishment began to constantly increase. Due to conflicts and climate change, many expect this trend to continue to worsen in the future. For the most recent year of data, about 9% of the world's population lacks basic access to food. This means that just over 700 million people are consistently undernourished. Since the human person is also a social being, we have social needs in addition to our physical needs. Anna will now describe one of the most foundational social goods needed to sustain families: access to adequate housing.
We obtain our data on inadequate housing from the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Housing is defined as inadequate if flooring is made from dirt, mud, or dung, or if walls and roofs are missing, or if walls and roofs are made from discarded materials such as cardboard or plastics. Due to possible measurement errors, as well as a change in the definition of inadequate housing, we're hesitant to comment on the trend. Nonetheless, according to the most recently available data, which may be an understatement, nearly 17% of the world's population, or just over 1 billion people, live in inadequate housing. Genevieve will now look at employment, perhaps one of the most foundational social goods needed to sustain communities.
Using data from the International Labor Organization, we calculated the distressed labor rate. The distressed labor rate includes the percentage of the labor force that is either unemployed or employed, earning less than $3.20 a day. The International Labor Organization argues that without outside assistance, the lives of workers earning less than $3.20 a day are at risk. In the graph before you, you can see that since 2013, the situation has continuously improved until the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020. There has been only a partial recovery that seems to have slowed in 2023. As of last year in 2023, just under a quarter of the world's labor force, nearly 850 million people, were unable to meet their basic livelihood needs through employment. Dr. S will now summarize our material welfare indicators.
Looking at the maps behind me, please note that the dark areas which are the areas that show where the lack of access to the basic material need is the most extreme. You can see that they're highly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. And in a few other countries, you can't really see Haiti because it's so small, but that's one of the other countries, Afghanistan and Venezuela, for some of these things, or many of these things. Yeah. Our key takeaways regarding material needs is that the data shows some improvements in the poor's access to water and adequately remunerated employment, but no significant improvement in the poor's access to adequate housing and a continued decline in the poor's access to food, leading to higher levels of malnourishment. In addition to material needs, Fordham's Pope Francis Global Poverty Report is equally concerned about spiritual freedoms. In the Catholic classical tradition, the human spirit is critical and consists of the intellect, the will, and the conscience. Anna will now begin our review of spiritual freedoms with respect to the intellect by looking at basic education and in particular, adult literacy rates. Literacy is a skill needed to empower the poor and understand their own situations.
From UNESCO, we obtained data on the adult illiteracy rate. The adult illiteracy rate is the percentage of the nation's population above the age of 15 who cannot read, write, or comprehend a simple statement about their ordinary life. Looking at the graph before you, we can see that for the most part, from 2013 to 2022, the global illiteracy rate has declined. Yet for the most recently available data, slightly more than 750 million people are illiterate. And we will now continue a review of human freedoms with respect to free will. Without civil liberties, the poor's desire and will to choose what is good for themselves and their loved ones will be frustrated. The civil liberty we focus on is gender equity, which by definition can affect up to half of the world's population. This, in particular, we track severe discrimination against women and girls that jeopardizes their health and survival rates.
Our data on gender equity comes from the World Economic Forum and their Health and Survival Index. The Health and Survival Index measures the gap between the expected healthy lifespan of females versus males, as well as the sex ratio at birth to capture the phenomenon of missing women. As shown in the graph, there was an initial reduction in the gender gap in 2014, but since that time, the health and survival situation of women relative to men has deteriorated, and it has become worse in 2022 than what it was in 2013. We estimate that roughly half of the world's female population, about 2 billion people, live in countries where the risk to their health and survival is severe. Anna will now complete our review of human freedoms with respect to the freedom of conscience by looking at the last spiritual freedom suggested by Pope Francis, religious freedom, a right championed by both the Second Vatican Council and the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Religious freedom can help us to form a conscience that can perceive what is right and empower us to do it.
Our data on religious freedom comes from the Pew Research Center and the Government Restrictions Index. The Government Restrictions Index is a compilation of 20 measures of restrictions, such as bans on particular faith or preferential treatments to one or more religious groups. Viewing the graph before us, we can see that starting in 2017, the world has experienced a significant increase in religious restrictions. We estimate that more than half of the world's population, about 4.5 billion people, live in countries where religious freedom is highly restricted. And we will now summarize our spiritual freedom indicators.
Looking at the maps, you can also see that the dark areas, which show where the lack of spiritual freedoms are the most extreme, are highly concentrated in Asia and North Africa. Our key takeaways are that progress in reducing illiteracy and protecting gender equity have not significantly improved recently, and we continue to observe a decrease in religious freedom. Dr. S. will now conclude our presentation.
In the Fordham Francis Index, we measured 7 dimensions of human well-being that respect the dignity of the poor and empower them to transform their lives and communities. Poor are some of the most basic material goods that people need in order to just survive. And 3 are some of the most critical spiritual freedoms needed to empower the poor to be able to transform their own lives. Based on the most recently available data, we found that serious gaps exist in all 7 dimensions. They range from a low of 9% to a high of 58% of the world's population. The average of all 7 gaps is the global poverty score. Based on the latest available data, the global poverty score is currently 25.8%, which is almost identical to last year's poverty score. As you can see on the graph, the last 2 data points are basically the same, indicating that this measurement has stalled over the past year. While we have observed some improvement in the poor's access to water and employment, we see no significant improvement in their access to housing, education, or gender equity, and we continue to see deterioration in the poor's access to food and a further erosion of religious freedom. So just to summarize that, 2 improvements, 3 no change or no significant change, and 2 declines. So basically overall no change if you think those are the important indicators of human welfare. So hopefully this stall in the recovery since the pandemic will be short-lived, and we will observe improvements in the global poverty score in the near future.
Thank you for your kind attention. To request a written copy of today's presentation, please email us at ibed@fordham.edu. You can also find a recording of all of today's morning presentations on Fordham's IBED YouTube channel. This time we welcome your questions and queries.
So we welcome your questions, and we have a system so the people online or live stream can hear your questions. We have 2 microphone systems in the room. And so we need, so they have to come up here to ask their question. All right. So if you have a question, we encourage it. We really welcome it. Those questions have proved very insightful in the past and have helped us to make some changes in how we do this. So we welcome your participation. And so if you just come up to the microphone and maybe show her where it is.
So thank you so much for the presentation. To present myself, maybe I'm Huyan Hakmi, also Fulbright scholar, doing my PhD at Fairfield University in Fairfield. So I have actually a few questions. The first one would be regarding like mainly Africa, because we have a lot of wars in the African continent, and we had like many missions, either of the United Nations or of the African Union. And when we look at the mandates of these missions, we can see like a lot of programs on development, access to water, education, and many things, because we have a nexus between development and security. And now like looking at the data, I can see that still like there is kind of like no improvement in a lot of indicators, which means either these programs, they are not really like implemented, or they are not really leading to improvement. And then since these indicators, I mean, they are deteriorating, it means that we're going to be having like more wars, like especially like in sub-Saharan Africa. And the second question is regarding religious freedoms, because like now we have like more and more limitations. And then I'm more interested like in Europe, because normally some countries, they have more limitations than other countries. Like speaking, for instance, about France, and then the ban of hijab and how is it called, like niqab and etc. But like from, can you go to the slide of religious freedoms in Europe? Because I can see it's kind of like similar like in different European countries, but I guess
the geographical map.
Yeah.
So you have to, this rotates. So
okay. I'm sorry. Okay. I can just ask my question.
Gender, and then the next one will be religious. Religious. There we go.
Yeah. Okay. So here, So basically we're like Spain and France are kind of the same, but or if we're going to say like the rules maybe in Spain, there's like nothing that talks really about like the ban of hijab and everything compared to France. And then like, isn't like France like now having like more limitations than Spain? So like I'm really interested like when it's comparing like the different European countries, and I want to ask, I mean, how updated are the data? And then because especially like recently we've seen like more and more laws with with all the changes in the political scene. Yeah, these are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, let me start with the African question, then we'll move to the religion and then the updated. So the Africa, I think the main concern was that what we're doing may not be effective. Oh, I violated my own rule. Or suggestion too. All right, so Africa first, religion, and then updated. The African thing, you saw that the trends weren't all that positive in many areas. Does that mean that your efforts are ineffective? And the thing we teach our students is that that's not a proof of that. Of course, you don't have what we call the counterfactual. What would have happened had you not done that? So had we not been involved, would the situation be worse? And I would argue that's probably the case. So you can't just take the overall macro trend to figure out whether your particular efforts have been useful or not useful, because there are so many other things going on that can counter you, and therefore you may be working against a desertification in an area, and you may think it's a little better, and they would have been much worse had you not been doing those efforts, is a very real possibility. So you got to be careful with saying, oh, things are not working and we're not, let's just give up and go home. Things could be a lot worse. That's the response to that one. The religion in Europe, I tend to focus more on the developing countries, but yeah, the European situation is interesting. I think we know about French history and how do you pronounce civil society in French? They have a tradition of yeah, and I don't fully understand that tradition, and therefore I would interpret it as an American, as some version of church and state separation, but I realize it's actually something very more complicated than what we deal with in the United States. So, and you can see if you favor something, you get a low score. So you can't, it's not just being anti-religion. You may actually be in favor of one particular religion. Then it's about the freedom of your conscience to choose or what your faith should be. And then the updated, that's always a problem, especially with macro level data. Our data, everybody's data is out of date. And we tried to put the dates, but we're going through so much, you can miss the dates. And the dates that are the most outdated are usually the religious freedom data. So the Pew, they're usually 3 years out of date. And everybody else is normally 2 years out of date. And once in a while, I think the food data is actually only 1 year out of date. So you do get some where they can actually tell you what was happening last year. But most of the time it's 2 years ago. And in the case of religious freedom, it's 3 years ago. So you got to factor that in, that we're reporting what all this report is based on is on the most recently available data. Most recently available data can be 1, 2, or 3 years old. Okay, any more questions? Sure, come on up. No, because they're gonna yell at me.
Question, I was waiting.
Oh,
Yeah.
why don't you both come up and don't go too far. So we'll do 1, 2.
Hello, good morning. I have also 2 questions. My first question is, over the last few years, have there been any other indicators that have been considered to be added or to complement the index? And then my second question is, have you noticed any significant correlations between indicators? For example, instinctually, I might think that level of education and gender inequity might have some sort of relationship, or the availability of water to the availability of food. So any correlations that might have been notable. And that's it. Thank you.
She has worked on this report before, so she knows how to drill down into things. Have we considered other indicators? The answer is yes. The one that we're thinking about most recently now is the one on housing. We're a bit disappointed with that measure because it gives some kind of strange results. They changed the measure to make it more difficult. Before, you just had to have a good floor. Now you have to have a floor, walls, and ceilings, and you would think that there would be less, and the number improved. So that, and then we dug a little deeper into some of the, it's based on household surveys that are done by national groups. And we will get reports coming in saying, oh, it's this percentage, and then they will correct it to a different percentage, and the correction would be really big, which then makes you have less faith in that statistic. The other problem with the housing is the statistic that I believe covers the least number of countries. So when you want to aggregate things, and you include that, that means you have to leave out a whole lot of countries. And so one of the debates we're looking at now is whether we can find something else, or should we exclude the housing indicator so that we can then include more people in the overall aggregation. And so that's a debate that we will continue to have. Correlations, there's, I'll give you three key themes on that. We find that the material goods are generally correlated, which would allow us to drop the housing and not lose too much information because it'd be covered by the other three material indicators. So housing, water, food, and employment tend to go together. And a little bit with the education. We tend to find that the religious freedom, gender are separate. So if you're concerned about human rights and you're concerned about development, they are not the same thing. They are statistically, they're not the same thing. In our view, the Pope Francis's view, he unites those and says you need both. But in the statistical thing, you can have this and not have that, than the other way around. And then the last one is interesting correlations. There's an especially interesting correlation dealing with environmental justice. So that's a key theme, environmental justice. Typically, it's about how the pollution is in the rich country and the disadvantages are in the poor country. But there seems to be a trade-off between employment correlated with use of renewable energy sources. In the movement to renewable energy sources, there seems to be a negative trade-off in employment, which means that the engineers around here have some work to do. We right now, if we move to renewable energy, we will create unemployment, more unemployment among the poor. And so what we have to figure out is how to develop a technology that is also friendly to employment of low-skilled people. And I think that I covered everything, so you're up.
Thank you. I'm David Yamego from Villanova University. My question is regarding the data because you're using secondary data. And I was wondering if you are also checking how those data have been collected. And also, it's still the same question, how do you update your numbers based on the previous study? If I'm asking that, it's with regard to water, a study that we have done in Ghana, we realized that hand pumps, when they build them, a year later, 42% of them are not working. So how do you update that? Because if you tell me, like this year we have 100 pumps working, I'm assuming next year it will be like only 52% of them that will be working. So how do you update that and letting people know what is going on? Thank you.
Sure, very good question. So this is a macro level question, and it highlights those of you who get into data, the complications of looking at data at the highest level. It has to be gathered from the lowest level, pass through a lot of filters before it gets to this level. So on the particular one of water, well, the water measure is access to a improved source. So it doesn't have to be a water pump, it could be improved source, and it's not the most the one that gives you the highest water quality. It's just a one level. And the people who do that are right next door at UNICEF with the WHO people. They have a task force that works on that. And again, they're doing local surveys. And the one that we have extremes here. So on one end, you have the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which has been doing this ever since the end of World War II, and have developed spent amazing amount of effort trying to figure out how they're going to define it, what they want to measure, how they're going to measure, and getting out in the field, collecting that and doing it. So I would say they have one of the strongest systems of collecting data on this. The weaker systems tend to be on those who are doing it more recently. So for example, to find data on gender equity is tough. You notice we don't get it from a UN agency. We don't get it from a government agency. We get it from the World Economic Forum. So that's a group just trying to put it together themselves. And they're drawing their data from health statistics. So it's it's inferred from health statistics that the females are getting better, living shorter than they should compared to what males are living, and that there's a whole lot of females missing. They get lost at birth somehow. So they seem to be reliable. And again, the one I have the most problems with is the housing. You know, you made the definition more restrictive, and you actually the measure improved. You have, and what it's based on is household surveys. So the macro data at the global level, never mind the national level, is dependent on the quality of the data that flows in. And of course, these organizations have their own mechanisms to try and check on that. And in some cases, they can do a lot. But you can see that in some of this household survey in particular countries, how can it go from, I forget the exact numbers, but it went from something like 30% one year inadequate housing to only 1% the next year. How is that possible? Either it was, how can you rehab all your housing so you can go from 39% to 1% in 1 year? So that's impossible. So that's a measurement error. So either it was somewhere close to 1% or it was somewhere close to 39%, and I have no idea which one is correct. And you would have to go down and talk to the people who actually conducted the survey in that country and say, what's going on here? Or why do you keep revising your numbers all the time? And you're looking at me, so I think our time is up. And we have a break, so we don't want to break. So if you have more questions, we're around. Lunch, during the break, whatever. Thank you.
Yes, please. As we noted, we do have a break now. You all were very efficient in getting back to your seats this morning. So I will trust you all to be in your seats at 11:01 a.m. on the dot. There's coffee, tea, and some, I think there's food back there, that you can help yourselves to. You can also ask questions to the presenters and come back ready to hear more about water. Okay. interactions, networking taking place, but we are going to get started again. And of course, you'll be able to continue those conversations during lunch. So is everyone feeling refueled, re-energized, excited? We're going to dive deeper into some of the technical challenges that people living in poverty face. And this year we've chosen to focus on water. So you heard from Kira, you've heard from Professor S and his colleagues on what is challenging the world at this time. And we are really, really grateful to have Lori Pearson, the Senior Technical Director of Food Security and Climate Change at Catholic Relief Services, to talk more about water and the global water crisis. So before I hand over the mic, once again, I'm going to do a bio introduction so you know more about Lori. She serves as the team leader for the Natural Resource Management and Climate Change team. And as a member of CRS's Agriculture and Livelihoods Division based in CRS's Baltimore headquarters, Lori focuses on the climate and food security nexus in CRS's agricultural programs. Lori co-leads a 10-year strategic initiative to scale restoration of degraded agricultural lands as a pathway to improved food security and climate adaptation for small-scale producers. Prior to this, Lori served as a team leader for institutional donor relations for Africa and as a senior policy advisor leading CRS's foreign aid reform agenda. She also spent several years in Africa and Latin America managing food security-related programming, including as CRS's country representative in Benin and assistant country representative in Peru. She began her career with the U.S. government's African Development Foundation, later serving as Associate Peace Corps Director for Agricultural Programs in Cameroon. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics, a master's degree in French, and a master's degree in environmental policy. Now that is quite a resume. And once again, a world traveler with us. So thank you so much, Lori, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Can everyone hear? Yeah, great, it's working. So thank you so much. It's really a privilege to be here. I'm going to do a little walking around because I'm going to look at my own slides here. And you can hit next already, right? I found that your Fordham Francis Index was really interesting, really relevant, and very aligned with the work that CRS is doing in integral human development. And I've prepared a few slides for you today that I hope you will also find interesting and relevant and can lead us into a good conversation after. And I know, as Brianna said, that you've asked me here to talk about water. So you may be wondering why, whoops, back up, why you're looking at an image of a farmer gazing lovingly at his soil. And I am definitely going to talk to you a lot today about soil health and land degradation, but I will also get to water, and I will also get to human dignity, because it's clear as Catholic institutions and from the report that you've done that we are trying for more than just the material well-being of the people we serve, but we are looking to help people achieve their full human potential and achieve dignity. And through this work, we can do that. And it's an important element of what drives us. And so with this foundation of mission, I wanted to start out by appreciating your Fordham Francis Index and the way you bring in material and spiritual well-being. And it recalled for me CRS's own integral human development framework, which, as you can see here on the left-hand side, has human assets that we're working towards to support that include also spiritual well-being. But it also outlines structures and systems that influence people's lives and impact people's lives. And our IHD, as we call it, IHD framework, calls on us to engage not just at that individual human level, but also with these structures and systems, because they can hold injustices in place. And so if we're working to help people achieve their full human potential and human dignity, we need to understand how they are connected to these systems and how these systems and structures influence their lives. Next slide. And so this IHD framework, I think, really reflects the interconnectedness of a multiplicity of factors that are complex. And this is something that Pope Francis talks about in his encyclical, the interconnectedness of things and the need to understand and act in an integrated way. And so I wanted to share with you one of my favorite quotes from Laudato Si, and that's where Pope Francis talks about the fact that humanity is faced not with two separate problems, one environmental and one social, but with a single complex problem that demands integrated solutions. And this quote really resonates with us at CRS, particularly with the agriculture team, because it's just an expression of what we see in our daily work, particularly as we're working with rural farmers who derive their food and their livelihoods directly from the land, right? We cannot separate the environmental status of their land and the poverty situation. We really need to address these together. And so next slide. So that brings me back to soils as a key connector. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about this photo. I've got a couple of images I wanted to share, but I wonder if anybody is brave enough and wants to jump up and just share what you see in this photo or what reaction you have to this photo before I start talking about it. What do you see? A lack of green, that is for sure. Anything else? Erosion, significant erosion. Anything else you want to point out? Do you see, they're the same color, so it's hard. There are two households right on the edge of that gully, right? Those households are in an incredibly precarious situation, right? And we don't know the story. This is a photo taken by a colleague of mine. We don't know how this hillside got there. We don't know the story, but there's enough green that suggests this was likely not always this way. And it's probably those households didn't settle there when it looked like this. So at some point, there was an amount of green. At some point, there was a possibility of farming. And there was probably a significant level of clear cutting and just denuding of the hillsides, maybe some burning. And now the water has just created these massive gullies. And if you look to the right of the Bolivia tagline there, you'll see where a landslide happened. You can see just a chunk of that hillside missing, right? So these people are very vulnerable and are not likely to be able to stay on that hillside for much longer. Next slide. And so this is a different hillside. There's also some topographic reality, right, in that last. Those are very steep hills, right, in the Andes. This is another less sloped, but still a sloped farm in an earlier stage of degradation, right? And if you look here at these rivulets of water coming down off that slope, it's clear that if nothing is done, they are going to create those same kinds of gullies that we just saw in the prior slide. And that if nothing is done, and you can already see on the lower end of the photo how much damage has been done to the farm, and at the upper end, the farm is looking a little healthier, right? If nothing is done, this family is also likely going to have to abandon this land. And we're seeing this happening in many of the places where we work, right? But the story doesn't stop there, because all those rivulets of water are washing away the topsoil. They're washing away the seed. They're washing away any fertilizer or pesticide that this family may have applied. And they're washing them right down into whatever waterway is waiting at the bottom of these hills, right? The next slide. So here's one more photo for you. And do you want to just share with me before I walk through it, what you see here, what strikes you in this photo? I know you see it. What color is that water? Red. Should water be red? No. This is a river in Madagascar where a couple years ago, about a year and a half ago, I traveled with the CRS team from the capital city in Antananarivo to a forest preserve where we are working with a conservation center and also with farmers in the area to introduce agroforestry methods to improve their livelihoods, improve their soil, diversify their income, but also to connect to this forest reserve and start to create a corridor for biodiversity. So we're looking for that double win of helping nature, but also in a way that helps people. And so we drove from Antananarivo to this forest preserve, 250 miles, a little more, and we paralleled this river the entire way. And I was staring at this river the entire way because I kept waiting for the moment when it was going to run clear. And that moment didn't happen until about 5 or 10 miles outside of the forest preserve. Why do you think that was? Any thoughts on why the water would have started to get clear there? Okay. If you look around, you can see some of that red soil, right? Some bare hillsides. And although the hillsides behind look green, they were once forested and there's green there now, but the trees are all missing. This was all once a forested area. And when you get to the forest preserve, the trees and that protected area is providing what we call the ecosystem services of filtering that water, helping the rain to percolate into the ground, replenishing aquifers, and allowing the river to run clean. But I was really amazed for 250 miles that the river looked like this the entire way. What do you think that this means for communities that are living along the banks of this river who don't have access to a water station that is pumping piped water or filtered or clean water and who are getting their water from local sources? Is this river a solution for them? Nobody wants to drink this water. You don't want your animals to drink this water. There's probably no fish in this water to provide food or a livelihood. You don't want to bathe in this water. You don't want to cook with it, right? This is a huge problem. And as this river flows closer to Antananarivo and to some of the peri-urban areas where you might harness the power of this river for milling or for hydroelectric power, it's not possible either because there's so much sedimentation in this river, it would gum up any machinery that it was trying to power. So this river is effectively lost to the people of Madagascar, right? It's not providing us support. This problem is not unique to Madagascar. We see this in other areas. I was recently with a government official from Malawi who commented half in jest, but also half in desperation, that Malawi is a top exporter of soil to the Indian Ocean. And this is a problem for Malawi. It's a problem for Malawi's agricultural production. It's a problem for Malawi's water access. It's a problem for hydroelectric. It's a problem for climate change adaptation, right? So next slide. CRS began to look at these trends that we were seeing over and over of declining yields and farmers, rain-fed dependent farmers being hit by shock, climate shock after climate shock, and sometimes still recovering from the first shock when the second shock hit. And we said, we have to do something. Not yet. We have to, can you back up? Back up. I'll share this in just a sec. We decided we needed to do something because this was really getting to a crisis level, and we wanted to get at a root cause. And we had done some research and saw from our own programming that where we're addressing the health of the soil and land degradation, we were having an enormous impact on food security, on climate resilience, and also on water. And so we launched this 10-year initiative to address land degradation, to get to all of these elements of well-being and prosperous future that people needed to have. And so what we are also seeing is that we have to work together in agriculture and in water to address this issue as a single interconnected issue. And I wanted to share some statistics with you about why that is. So first, agriculture runoff and sediment are responsible for 70% of the pollution of freshwater resources globally. Agriculture consumes 70% of extracted water from aquifers, and half of the world's aquifers are being depleted at a rate faster than they are being replenished by groundwater. Next slide. So again, when we launched this strategic platform, strategic initiative, we started looking at measuring really what are the results we are seeing. And we identified that we are reversing this topsoil loss, this incredible erosion, the gullying. In places we're seeing these gullies fill back in, and farmers are taking the land over again and beginning to cultivate it. We are locking in soil moisture into farms through some of the practices that we're using. So we're increasing rainfall use efficiency, and that means that during a drought, farmers can continue to produce, whereas farmers using traditional methods are often losing their crops and dependent on food assistance. We are increasing rainwater percolation into the soils, which is resulting in increase in both ground and surface water. And we're seeing that through well levels. We're measuring the levels of wells at the beginning and after some of these interventions. We're seeing it in stream flow. We're seeing it in streams that were running dry in the dry season that are now perennial and always providing water. And we're seeing it also with community elders telling us, oh, you know, my mother had always said that there was a water source there, but I've never seen it. And that water source has reappeared. And we've heard this in multiple communities, that water sources are springing back that people had never seen. Next. Also, to get at the agricultural results, we're also seeing around an average of 60% increase in yields. And that is also leading to increases in income, in some cases, a doubling of income. We're trying to get better statistics on this. But when this is also linked to cash crops like coffee, you can see already the difference in quality of those 2 ears of maize, right? One produced with what we're calling water smart agriculture and one produced with traditional methods. When that gets applied to cash crops, the quality increase is driving an amazing price increase that goes beyond a doubling. So really critical impacts. And I shared with you some concerning statistics there, but I wanted to come back to your report because it gets back to one of the key messages that we are trying to deliver about the need to link agriculture and water and soils if we want to get to clean water and improved access to clean water. So your report talks about a decline in access to drinking water of a pretty alarming 5% over a decade. I think it begs the question of what's driving that decline. And I am sure that part of it is investment in infrastructure, investment in behavior change and information and good governance. But I would bet a lot of it is also driven by climate change and the impacts that we're seeing, the exacerbation of degradation by climate shocks that we're seeing. And since we know from the IPCC and from other researchers that climate is expected to drive resource scarcity and climate change is expected to worsen, I think we can anticipate that this trend that you've identified is also likely to worsen. And so we need to do something about it. And part of doing something about it is ensuring that our approaches to clean water and water access also include approaches for source water protection. Next slide, right? So we really need to be linking, again, these water and agriculture efforts to achieve both as a common solution, an integrated solution. And at CRS, we are really looking at farmers and herders as the stewards of the natural resource base and the agents of change, right? And so we want to work with them to incentivize uptake of these improved practices at the plot level, at farm level, but also collective action at the community level so that communities are taking care of their common resources. And we're finding, and we've gone back and we've done some ex post evaluations of work that was done 10 or 15 years ago, and we are finding that when communities are working together and when they understand the benefits and are linking the benefits that they're receiving to the improvements that they're making in their watersheds and their farms, they are sustaining those practices and sustaining the watershed structures that they've built. And so the other thing to round it all off that we're seeing in this work, because we're promoting collective action and working together, we're seeing improvements in social cohesion, right? And mutual understanding. And we're also having farmers tell us that they feel empowered by this work, that they didn't think they could make a change, but now with the knowledge and these practices, they're seeing very tangible impacts on their lives. And this takes us right back to human dignity. And I just wanted to end with some of the quotes that farmers have shared with us about how they feel about this work. We have one farmer in Malawi with a watershed restoration program that told us our whole community would be hungry and our children malnourished if not for this project. At first, I thought we couldn't do anything, but now we are confident because we have water. This is a community, actually, where at the beginning of the project, this same farmer talked about women fighting for water at the wells because there wasn't enough. A colleague of mine went a year ago to visit this community again, and there was all kinds of construction work going on. And he asked this farmer, he said, "What's going on here? What's all this?" And the farmer said, "Things have only gotten better. There's so much water coming back because of the measures that they took that the government approached their community and negotiated construction of an irrigation system to deliver water to a neighboring community." So these practices can have major impact if investment is sustained and if farmers and communities feel the ownership and the benefits of doing this work. Another farmer in Malawi said, "Our children are healthy and no longer malnourished due to lack of food. We own this watershed. No one else can manage it for us but us." And that is empowerment to me. That is one of the most rewarding things that we can hear from a farmer. In another quote from Niger, where there were a number of displaced people due to conflict, the CRS team there negotiated with owners of abandoned land that was so degraded it was no longer being cultivated, and got long-term leases and trained the displaced people in land restoration approaches so that they could begin practicing agriculture again and also reduce the need for food aid that was coming in. And the farmer said, "In the crisis, I lost everything. This project has made a difference in my life because I can work as I did before. I am regaining my dignity. And that is ultimately, I think, what we're after in this work, addressing the material well-being, but also that spiritual well-being and helping people to really achieve their full human potential and dignity. And so I'll leave it at that and we can go to questions.
I'm just going to remind. Thank you so much. So just a reminder for questions and answers. If you have a question, we ask that you come up here so that everyone online can see you. And again, if you're not comfortable with that, you can write the question down, hand it to me, and I'll ask the question for you. So thanks. I don't remember how you did this.
Oh, do you need this one? I can.
Yeah, so we have a double system. You'll hold this one. And you will.
That's fine.
stand.
Just in.
And I will.
Hi, thank you so much for that awesome presentation. So I'm just kind of curious, you know, the Fordham Index was talking about also gender equality. I know we were talking about correlations and stuff. And I've learned that women play a really important role in agriculture, especially we often think of farmers and herders as men, and that, you know, also is an important factor in a lot of rural communities. But can you speak to like how these projects have they impacted like the women's role in the community and in their economy, and kind of the role they play, especially in like food and water in their communities for their families. And so yeah, is that part of the program as well? Is there a facet of that? Just curious.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, that's, can everyone, is this working? Okay, great. That's a really important question. And yes, we are working, there's so many women farmers, and often women farmers are dealing with the food crops where men may be dealing with cash crops in many countries. That is the breakdown. Or women may be doing the weeding work and some of the backbreaking work, right? And so one of the ways that we tackle that is with information sharing. We have a team of gender experts that we work with that talk about, do trainings in inter-household decision-making, and really working, again, some of this social cohesion work that we're doing also gets at gender issues. So trying to bring communities together, trying to ensure that community working groups are inclusive and representative of the different users and groups of people, particularly vulnerable groups in the community, so that everyone has an equal say. And we've seen some really tremendous results coming from those efforts at social cohesion. So one example is just to say, to give an example of a program in India where communities had developed groups to work on restoring the watershed. And there was tension across different resource users and lack of support for the women who were involved in this watershed committee. And when we started the social cohesion work and the information sharing and gave opportunities for people to share their perspectives, we measured at the end of the program, a year and a half later, this is a very short program on organizational structure. What we found is that not only were spouses who were originally against having their wives participate in the watershed community now supportive, a number of spouses actually joined the committee as well, wanting to support their wives to do this work. So that household decision-making and social cohesion are a critical part of making sure that women's issues are taken consideration of. We're also very focused on women's labor. So understanding in the practices that we're promoting, if those have a higher implication, a higher burden for women, and what we can do differently, and how we can also sensitize some of the men and community and decision makers to understand the role of women and the labor burden that women face. So,
short answer to a big problem, but thanks.
I just have one question about what you just talked about. I just would like to know a bit about more the process, just more specifically. You're going into these countries and you're telling them, okay, well, women and men, you should change the gender role, the pre-existing gender role. Men in those communities tend to have more power. How do you go about that? How do you tell the men in those communities? I presume, I don't know the specifics of the process, but how do you go about that? You know, I mean, did Malawi have pushback when, for instance, you were remedying the problem with the water, and then you had to, you know, have you had any pushback? That's my question as well. It's my second question.
Yeah, thanks. So I should say we have a whole team of gender experts who would be much better placed to answer that question than I. I think one thing I would say is they're not entering in, bringing groups together saying you need to do things differently. They're bringing in groups of people representative across different, marginalized, potentially marginalized groups into conversation and asking how they're working together, what problems they face. And then specifically between men and women, there is a whole household decision-making training that men and women couples can sign up for and willingly agree to join. And so I think you raise an important point. It's not you're doing it wrong kind of discussion, or you need to do things differently. It's trying to bring people together to understand each other's perspectives and to look at opportunities to support one another. And that's generally what we're seeing, is that there uptake of support and desire to be, even in Ethiopia, there was a time, and this also in a community that was dealing with disabled people, when some of the community leaders and municipal decision makers understood the contribution of both women and the labor issues of women, but also the contributions that people with disabilities were making. They instituted a Help Your Wives Work Day, things, very original, innovative efforts by community leaders to tackle this problem as well. So not imposed from outside.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about the relationship between your office at CRS and the sort of local implementing partners? Because I imagine issues related to land, especially its intersection with gender and household bargaining, will require a certain degree of local knowledge. And then also, second part of the question, how does that relate to the sustainability of these projects with the agricultural practices and keeping these water sources clean going forward?
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a multifaceted question. So first of all, again, CRS really espouses a principle of local leadership. We are working to support communities to take charge of their own issues, to try to provide knowledge, to try to be a catalyst, but we are not directly implementing, with the possible exception of emergency response in really drastic situations. But in our development work, we are always working through local partners with a focus on capacity building, and listening and inclusion, and again, trying to get to those structural issues, right, to help people to make their own change. And I think that's what we're seeing from those farmers. We brought knowledge, introduced new practices, did not oblige anyone to pick it up, right? This is an opportunity to share. And then, and in this program in Malawi, for example, that I was talking about, there's a video about it where this farmer that I quoted talks about starting out with, I don't know, 50 or 75 men that were all prepared, and women that were all prepared to work on the watershed. And when they saw how much work it was, all of them but 6 dropped out. But those 6 continued to work. And as the rest of the community started to see the benefits, they started to join in again, right? So that's one of the important things, is helping people to see what benefits they will get so that they make their own decision that this is valuable, I want to do this. The farmer who is holding up the 2 ears of maize, as with many farmers, don't adopt these practices necessarily on their entire farm. We'll talk to them, we'll talk about these new approaches, and they'll dedicate a portion of their farm. And then they'll see the results that they get. Farmers are very risk averse. They don't have much to fall back on if things go wrong, right? So they'll try it on a portion of their farm. And when they see the difference, they begin to spread the adoption, and then they begin to be champions with their other farmers, their neighbors, to promote these practices. So I hope I answered. I think there was more to your question. Maybe.
I think that gets at the sustainability aspects as well.
Yeah, just to say that sustainability is huge. And again, that has everything to do with the benefits of these practices accruing back to the people who are taking up these practices. And that issue of equity is huge, right? And one of the things to look at sustainability that we're experimenting with is payment for ecosystem services, so that there is, if farmers are undertaking changes that clean up that river in Madagascar, and that benefits a milling company downstream, trying to negotiate with them to provide some payments to that community to continue the maintenance of those programs. It is very much about equity and the rewards of that work, as any of us would want, right? So.
So first of all, well, thank you for the great presentation. Kind of building off of that, I wanted to ask about, obviously a lot of the places that you are working in have governments that are, shall we say, not so amenable to foreign work, particularly US-based foreign aid. And if it's not a government, it might be like, say, in Ethiopia, a local military power, Tigray, or it is a government and it's militia in like Venezuela. And I was wondering if you could talk some about the challenges that you face in kind of showing these people that this is good work that you'd be doing, and what you do if you do face resistance from a government or other local authority in trying to provide this kind of aid. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a tough question. I think, so CRS is working in the countries where we work at the invitation of the Catholic Church. So if we have a physical presence in a country, it's because the church has invited us to be there, and the church is absolutely our partner. In most of the places where we are working, we're supported and welcomed, and we are, again, because we have the approach of investment in local leadership and capacity building. We're not seen necessarily as an outsider imposing, right? And we're there at the invitation of local actors. And we try to very much work in conjunction with governments, supporting government extension workers, creating dialogue, creating convening. That's not to say that we're not in some difficult spots, and that's particularly probably more of our emergency work. I'm thinking of places like Sudan or maybe Somalia, where there are huge problems of conflict. And again, even in those cases, for us to maintain a physical presence in the country, there has to be agreement from the government for us to be there. And we do our best to serve the needs of the people. We don't engage in politics. but we address conflict and we address needs. And, it's not that we've never been asked to leave a country either, right? I probably have to call on other colleagues, but I'm sure there have been countries where the situation has gotten so bad that we've had to leave. But by and large, we've got the support we need.
Thanks for your presentation. I just had a quick question. So with like the threat of climate change, it'll obviously like affect the agriculture industry with like public health and environmental health problems. So I was wondering if CRS had any like adaptation or mitigation strategies, like working with these countries to help with the agriculture sector with the threat of climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, this strategic initiative on restoring degraded agricultural land is actually very much a climate change response that addresses both adaptation and mitigation to the extent that it does include restoring carbon into soils and some amount of tree planting. So there are mitigation co-benefits. But we're also, our response to climate goes much beyond just land degradation and understanding how climate is affecting all of the sectors that we work in, how it can be a driver of conflict, of health issues. And so we're in the process now of creating, working towards an agency-wide strategy and mainstreaming climate into all of our sectors. But we do have a tool, a climate risk assessment tool, that we use in countries to help people survey across what they're doing to understand what the risks are, what the particular risks of climate are in that geographic region, because of course it's very contextual, it may be drought, it may be flood, right? And then what are the particular vulnerabilities of the people we're trying to work with, and then to identify a set of solutions that can address those. And again, in collaboration with government actors, because climate is so big, this is not something a typical project, geographic bound project is going to address. It needs to be connected to wider policy issues as well. Oh, there's one more.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just want to go back to one of the answers you provided, which means to go and work in places where we have conflict. For instance, you mentioned like Somalia and Sudan, and we know there is like an ongoing conflict, and the obstacles, the challenges would not come from the government, but in Somalia that would come from Al-Shabaab, for instance, the terrorist groups in there. But then my question is, because I have also we're talking to other organizations who are supposed to do some work in there, but because of the conflict, they are not doing it. And the thing is that the security situation is worsening more and more, and then the people, they are suffering more and more. So if this organization, they are never able to go there and help, I mean, how are they going to improve maybe the situations? And then my question here, because we have also missions of the United Nations and of the African Union and the European Union, they are already there. I mean, do you maybe work with them, to synchronize maybe, because this way, you would be able, to do your work there, and that's going to be less challenges for you. So this is my question. More the alignment of work of you with the other organizations that are already out there. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So again, this is probably my colleagues who work in our emergency team will be better placed to answer, but this is a really important question. I do know that in countries where there are high levels of conflict or huge disasters, and there are multiple organizations that are trying to provide aid, the UN generally plays a coordinating role. And we would be part of that network of organizations that comes and responds to the UN and how they're coordinating things. We also, again, because of our approach to working through local organizations, we very often have access to these difficult areas because we're working with partners who are based in difficult areas, and we're supporting them. So it's not the American team going in and trying to directly provide support. It is the American team standing behind and providing logistical support, strategic support, capacity building support to a local team that continues to have access. So I think that's. in a nutshell.
All right, a round of applause. Switch mics here. Okay, thank you again to Lori for that technical but really interesting dive into some of CRS's work and everything that they're doing to improve the day-to-day life of those living in poverty or facing challenges that we hear about just heard about in the Pope Francis Poverty Index report. So please know our prayers and hopes are with you as you continue this work. And there is a way to get involved. So we're going to hear from Jessica Morel, though most of you probably know her as Jess. She's the volunteer manager for educational institutions at Catholic Relief Services, and she's going to come up here for an advocacy ask, which all of you can take out your phones for. Before we jump into it, I'd just like to let you know that Jess loves getting to work with over 75 schools across the country. Some of you are here today in supporting their partnerships with CRS. Jessica lives outside of Philadelphia, where she is a volunteer firefighter, EMT, and on a water rescue team. She's an avid Phillies fan and national park enthusiast, and her favorite thing to do, which we have in common, is spend time with her nieces and nephews. So give it up for Jess.
Thank you, Brianna, and thank you, Lori, so much. It's always so inspiring to hear the work of CRS around the world. And Dr. Oh, there, I was gonna say, where are you? Dr. S, iPad program, so impressive. Thank you for all your hard work and everything that goes into the Poverty Index report. So, and thank you all for being here, by the way. Awesome. So many of the university students and chapter members, some of our high school advisors, just so grateful that you could attend today. And now that we've spent a lot of time learning, I know I learned a lot. I'm hoping you all did too, and some reflection. Now the challenge is let's act, right? So we've learned, we've reflected. What can we do about this, right? And there's a lot of things, and one of those things is to advocate. We need your voice. Your voice is important. You play a crucial role in making sure that Congress and our politicians in DC know about what's going on and know what you care about. So we care about clean water, we care about the vulnerable, and this is a way to use your voice. So up here on the screens, we have an opportunity for you to act. You can either text climate change to 67768, or you can scan the QR code and it should auto-populate that for you. But right now, the United Nations Climate Conference, you might know it as COP29, is actually happening in Baku, Azerbaijan. Yes, I tried to practice that pronunciation earlier, so. But there, and in the coming months, the US has the opportunity to uphold some climate commitments and to support future climate policy. And it includes financial support for the programs that Lori was speaking about, for adaptation programs and dealing with climate and water. And we really want to let Congress know that we care about that. So this is your opportunity to let them know. Again, it's super easy. You text, you'll get a response back and you're going to get a form. So I'm going to give you all a second to do that. And within that form, and nobody has to do this, by the way, but we appreciate your participation. And when you get that form, I really, really encourage you to put a little personal message in there. Why do you care? Why are you here today? You know, why do you care? Make that personal so your message really sticks out. And the awesome news about doing advocacy like this with CRS is when you put in your zip code, this automatically will send to both senators and your representative according to the zip code that you use. So I encourage you all to act, participate. These QR codes, these links, these things like that, we can help you use them on your campuses, at your place of work, wherever you'd like to be. But we just encourage you to use your voice for the vulnerable, and we can all do this together. Let's get that the stall on the poverty index to go down. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for your time, and please grab a water bottle.
All right, so we're going to leave this up on the screen so that you have a few minutes to scan it, to text, and to write your message. There's a few things we're going to do now, but first I'm going to give another thank you to all of you for being here today and for those of you joining online. to the Fordham iPad students, to Lori, and to everyone from CRS as well. And we're going to close out our online program just with a round of applause for that. And then I have a few housekeeping announcements for those of you that are here in the room. If you are not a CRS University chapter, your lunch is here in the back of the room.